All right. Hey, everybody. You guys know the drill when it comes to these. We are going to be listening to this presentation and listening to the first half of our nervous system today. I say half, it's not half. The first section of the nervous system. We are starting a new unit today. So if you guys will just follow along, you're going to fill out the notes that are given to you. I just gave those to you, so you're going to kind of start to fill those out. But yeah, we are going to go ahead and get started. This unit, I think you guys are going to like. And it's not quite as complex as the last two were. And so I think you guys are really going to enjoy getting to know how your brain works and how it basically controls pretty much everything that we do. So we are going to go ahead and get started. So we're just going to start with the functions of the nervous system, just like we normally do. Always start with the functions. So the nervous system has three main functions: sensory, integration, and motor. So the sensory function of the nervous system basically is going to monitor stimulus. So kind of like we talked about in the muscular system, right? We have a stimulus that is going to come from the brain that's going to stimulate muscle contraction. So that would be the sensory function of the nervous system working. So this kind of monitors stimulus from inside and outside of the body as well. So just kind of monitors all of those kind of stimulus sensory um, kind of experiences that we are going to have. And then second is integration. So this is going to just be the process of sensory input. So basically it just decides what needs to happen. So it's going to take that sense, it's going to receive that message and say, okay, something's going on. We need to figure something out to do. So this integration function kind of is that step two, and it's going to decide, okay, this is what has to happen in order for this function to occur. Which kind of brings us to our last function, which is motor. So this is the actual response that's going to be activated due to this stimulus. So again, it kind of starts with that sensory. So it starts with that stimulus, some sort of stimuli, and then the brain is going to decide what needs to be done, what it needs to communicate in order to make that specific thing happen. And then the motor function would be the actual response by activating muscles or glands or something to cause some sort of action to happen. So these are the primary functions of our nervous system. This is kind of how everything works pretty much in our bodies. We are communicating with our brains. Any type of function that we have to do, our brain is going to be the one we communicate with. So we're going to talk a lot more about that. But this kind of gives you a good general idea of the functions of the nervous system. So structural organization. So we have two components of our nervous system that we're going to talk about. So the first one is our central nervous system. So central, you can kind of think this is like the hub of our nervous system. So it contains both the brain and the spinal cord. So you can see in this picture here, here is our brain, and then we have our spinal cord that is running through our vertebrae. So those are kind of the central kind of center, I guess you can say, for our nervous system. This is kind of the main part of our nervous system that is functioning. So that is our central nervous system. And then we also have our peripheral nervous system. So if you think about the word peripheral, right? When we say use your peripherals, we say, kind of use the outside angle, I guess you could say, if you were looking from the side. So peripheral nervous system is kind of the same thing. So we have our central, which is kind of right there in the center, and then our peripheral is everything that is to the side of that. It's kind of the secondary source for our nervous system. And so these are all of the nerves that we have all throughout our entire body. So they extend from the brain and the spinal cord. So they extend from the central nervous system, but then they are going to extend through the rest of the entire body. We have nerves all throughout our body. And so that would be considered our peripheral nervous system. Okay, so we have two types of neural tissue that our nervous system is composed of. The first is neurons, which we are going to talk a lot about today. We have many different types of neurons, so we are going to talk about all of those today. And these neurons, they're going to react to change. So they're going to send those nerve impulses. They are going to actually do the responding. So those neurons, they play a very, very important role. And then our second type of neural tissue or nervous tissue is neurological cells. I'm sorry, neuroglial cells. I'm having a long morning. Neuroglial cells. And these cells, they're just going to surround the neurons. So they kind of serve, I guess, as you could say, that kind of extra layer of protection. They're going to nourish those neurons, but they also are going to send and receive the messages. So the neuroglial cells, they are going to receive any impulse that is coming from the brain and the spinal cord, and they are going to kind of receive that message, and then they are going to send the message back out once the neuron has decided what impulse it's going to send. So they're kind of like the middleman, they're kind of the messenger, whereas the neuron is the one that's actually kind of doing the work. So they pretty much serve just as the messenger for the neurons. Okay, so here is a picture of a neuron. So I know this kind of looks really weird and probably looks fairly complex. You will have a sheet in your notes today that will look like this. It should be the last page of your notes, where we are going to label and color the different parts of different neurons. So that should help kind of understand, where the separation of all of these things are. But we are also going to look at a bunch of different neurons as well. So really, I guess the biggest thing I want to point out here to you guys is one, the nucleus of this neuron. So we can see this is a very odd shaped cell. It does not look like a typical cell, but we have our nucleus that's right here in the center of our cell body. So our cell body is going to be these kind of branching, weird looking structures, kind of tree thing that we see here. That's our cell body, and our nucleus is always going to be in the center of that cell body. And then this specific type of neuron, they have an axon. So this axon that's going to extend kind of serve as the tail of the cell. Not all neurons have these. We are going to talk about a couple of different kinds today, like I said. This one just happens to have an axon as well, with these little coats of protection called myelin sheaths. So those are just kind of some things to point out with this specific neuron. But really, the main thing I wanted us to look at was this cell body and this nucleus right here in the center. But like I said, you're going to get lots of practice kind of identifying these different parts of the different neurons. All right, so speaking of parts of a neuron, like we just said, cell body. The cell body is going to contain the nucleus. That's kind of just its main function is to be the body and to contain that nucleus. We have two types of processes or different types of fibers that are going to be extending from the cell body. So like we saw those little branching pieces, that's what it means by processes. So one is a dendrite. Okay, so a dendrite is a type of process that's going to receive stimuli. That's the biggest part of that. You'll see that these parts that are underlined, those are the parts in your notes that we should be taking. But they are going to receive the stimulus. So the dendrite, those are those branching cells that are coming from the cell body. They are receiving that stimulus upon arrival, I guess you can say. And they have hundreds and hundreds of these dendrites per neuron. So we'll see many of them so they can receive many messages so that they can cause a reaction to happen. And then the second one, like we talked about, is that axon. So that axon was the tail that we looked at on that picture just a minute ago. And neurons only have one axon most of the time. So we will typically only see one little tail that's going to stick out from the cell body. And these are going to conduct nerve impulses away from the cell body. So whereas the dendrite, they kind of received the stimuli, the axon is going to conduct these nerve impulses away from the cell body. So they are going to pretty much send the messages back out. They are getting it away from the cell body. So that is pretty much its function, is just to kind of send those nerve pulses out away from the cell. Okay, so the myelin sheath, okay, this is what we looked at in that picture as well. So those were kind of the coating along the axon. So if we look at this picture over here, this purple branching structure, that's our cell body. The little tree branches that we see, those would be the dendrites that we looked at earlier. And then this tail-like structure here, that's our axon. So you'll notice on these axon, it kind of looks like they have kind of some long beads on them. They almost look like in kindergarten when you would make like macaroni necklaces. That's kind of what I imagine when I see this, because it kind of just looks like little pieces of macaroni beads. But they are going to serve as just kind of that insulation. It is made up of a lipid material. So lipid, we have kind of talked about this before. Lipid means fat. So this is just a fatty structure that's going to serve as some extra insulation for this axon. And this is made up of these cells that we call Schwann cells. So that's kind of a weird word, Schwann cells. So our axon again, we have our little tail here. It's going to be covered by these little insulated beads that we call a myelin sheath, which are made up by Schwann cells. So as you can see in this picture, there are some gaps between our myelin sheaths, okay? So that you kind of a little bit of exposing that underneath surface. So we call those gaps the nodes of Ranvier, okay? Don't know why, that's just what we do, okay? So that is what these little gaps are called, okay? So again, these are just kind of some specialized cells that are in between our myelin sheaths. So that pretty much covers all of the anatomy of an axon. So again, here is our cell body with our dendrites. I don't know if y'all can see my mouse. I really hope y'all can. But we have our dendrites that are branching off of our cell body with our nucleus in the center. And then we have our process that we call an axon that is going to extend from our cell body, and it is covered by insulated sheets called myelin sheaths, sheaths with a TH, myelin sheaths, that are going to insulate our axon. And these myelin sheaths are made up of our Schwann cells, and then the gaps in between our myelin sheaths, those are our nodes of Ranvier. Solid. Love it. Great job. We got it. Okay, so just an example of a disease of the nervous system. We're kind of going to be sprinkling a couple of these nervous system diseases or neurological disorders, as we could call them, kind of sprinkled in between our lesson for this unit. But multiple sclerosis, some of you may have heard of this before. This is a example of a neurological disorder. So multiple sclerosis is basically when these myelin sheaths, so our little insulated pads here, they're going to become very damaged. So we can see in this picture here, kind of has now turned into like a brainy-like structure. It is not compact like we saw in the one up here, but it's going to become very damaged and even hardened. And this can actually cause people to lose control of muscle movement. So, as we said, our brain is our control center for pretty much everything that we do, especially our muscle movement. We learned that in our last unit. And so, when these myelin sheaths are damaged, they're not able to kind of receive that stimulus from the nervous system, from the muscular system adequately. And so they're going to basically not be able to control the functions of our muscular system anymore. And so this can cause people to lose control of their muscle movement. So that is what multiple sclerosis is. We are going to do a project later on, probably after we get back from Thanksgiving break, where some of you may actually be looking at multiple sclerosis a little bit in more detail. So if that's interesting to you, great, let me know, and that might be one that you can do this project on. But yeah, so that's one of the many neurological disorders that we are going to discuss in this unit. Okay, so now we're going to continue kind of looking at neurons. I said we were going to talk about a couple of different neurons today, so that is what we are going to do right now, is just look at these different neurons. So we have sensory neurons. So sensory neurons, we call these afferent, afferent, however you want to say that. But they are going to carry impulses from sensory receptors in the organs and the skin to the central nervous system. So when we see CNS, that stands for central nervous system. So these sensory neurons, they're going to carry, right? They're going to carry those senses from these sensory receptors. So you can put sensory and sensory together, that we have in the organs and the skin, and they're going to carry it to the central nervous system. So that's one of the classifications of a neuron. We also have motor neurons, or efferent. Okay, so we have afferent and efferent, and these are going to carry impulses from the central nervous system, so away from the central nervous system, to the muscles or the glands. So our muscles and the glands, right, they're going to be what actually does the action. The central nervous, or the nervous system, does not actually do the action. They just, basically, they are like the dictator, and they just tell everybody what to do. So if you think about sensory nerves, okay, sensory neurons, they are going to take the sense that we are getting from the body. Okay, so they're going to take those senses and they're going to send it to the central nervous system, where the central nervous system is going to decide what has to happen. So once the central nervous system decide what has to happen, our motor neurons, so motor pretty much means like movement or function. So our motor neurons are then going to carry that impulse from the central nervous system. So it's carrying it away from the central nervous system to the muscles for that action to happen. So you can think that motor makes the motion. Sure, why not? Motor makes the motion. Sensory takes the senses. So that's pretty much the difference between the two of those. If you need me to re-explain those, please let me know. I definitely want to make sure we understand the difference between these two neuron classifications. All right, and then we have association neurons. So these are kind of our interneurons. So these are the kind of in between. But these are going to connect our motor and our sensory neurons. So they're the middleman. They're going to connect the two of these together to kind of form our pathway for sending messages throughout our nervous system. Okay, so like I said, going to be talking about different types of neurons. So a multipolar neuron, this would be an example of a multipolar neuron, has many processes. So what we mean by that is a multipolar neuron has both dendrites, so there are little branching structures here. They have dendrites as well as an axon. Okay, so this would be exactly what we looked at the picture earlier. So this, again, here's our cell body. We have these branching dendrites, and then we also have our long axon as well. This is the most common type of neuron that we will see, which is why it has been the one that has been the example so far throughout this entire presentation. So again, multipolar, it has multi-processes, so it's going to have both the dendrites and the axon as well. We also have a bipolar neuron. Okay, so think bi, we know means two, so it's going to have something to do with two. So it's going to have two processes. It's going to have one axon, so here's our axon right here, and only one dendrite. So whereas the one before, I'll go back so we can see that. Oh, maybe. We see we have many dendrites right here, okay? So that's why it's called multi. But then a bipolar neuron is only going to have one dendrite, so one little branching structure, and one axon. Okay, these are very rare, but they are sometimes found in some special senses organs. So some of our organs that deal with special senses. So again, this is a bipolar, so we have two types of processes. We only have one dendrite and we have one axon. Okay, and then lastly, we have a unipolar neuron. So unipolar, uni means one, so it's going to have a single process emerging from the cell body. Okay, so we can see we have axon here, and then the dendrites are actually stemming from the axon rather than the cell body. So here's our cell body here. It's also called a soma. Okay, so we have our cell body here, and it's going to have the one axon, single process that is going to emerge from the actual cell body. All right, so that pretty much covers all of the different types of neurons that we are going to be covering. So, what we are going to do next, if you missed anything in the notes, make sure you go back and get those written down. And then, what we are going to do now is we are going to work on this sheet that is in the back of your notes. Okay, this is going to be extremely helpful when you are identifying the different parts of a neuron, especially when it comes to the different types of neurons. So, what we have here is a word bank. Okay, so here's your word bank, and it actually has these letters that are already associated with it that are already labeled over here. So, what you can do is, I would even go in. You can write the labels if you want. If not, you have your kind of letter code over here on the side. But I have plenty of colored pencils, or you can use your own, or you can use colored markers or pens or whatever you have to kind of help more easily identify these things. So you can kind of color in the different areas that are going to help you when it comes to classifying these different things. But yeah, that is pretty much what we are going to work on next. So if you guys have any questions about this lesson, please let me know. I would be more than happy to answer any questions, but we have finished up part one of our nervous system. So great job. Let me know if y'all need